You're listening to the Talking Headways podcast network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week I'm joined by Danny Pearlstein of Riders Alliance to talk about the 1-year anniversary of congestion pricing in New York City. We chat about the history of the idea, the mobilization of activists to turn the cameras on, and sour grapes from New Jersey and USDOT. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super amazing and kind Patreon supporters. We appreciate you all keeping this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire going. To join this merry band of subway crayonistas and city smarties, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers and a handwritten note sent with a cool train station stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scars. And if you want to just give a single dollar a month, you'll be able to get the podcast with 0 outside ads or podcast recommendations in Patreon. We'll leave information in the show notes about how to do it and how to get it into your podcatcher. We've also recently put up some bonus material and have weekly free posts from our newsletter intro, so check it out if you haven't already. And speaking of scarves, it's still winter, so get your heavyweight bus or bike scarves. You definitely need one for you, your friends, your colleagues, and for the anti-bus activists you just want to frustrate. If you want to get one of the bus or bike scarves or the lightweight bike scarf for hot climates, visit theoverheadwire.com or support us on Patreon. Just a quick note to interject, because I didn't want to record the whole thing over again, but we have actually sold out of the bus-only knit scarves, but they'll be back in stock in 3 weeks. I've made another order, and they'll be back soon, so just hang in there. We had some big orders come in, and we appreciate that, but then we also figured out that we ran out, so check back in with us in a couple weeks, or you can pre-order. Send me a note, and we'll send one to you right away as soon as we get them back in stock. There are many other ways to support the show, including buying books from the bookshop site, either the books from the authors we interview or any book you like. Bookshop.org/shop/The Overhead Wire. And find our Cars Are Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/carsarecholesterol. And for anything else, including the Town Planning and Practice audiobook that plays like a podcast, visit theoverheadwire.com. You can also get that podcast from Libby at your public library. And finally, definitely sign up for the now 20-year-old daily newsletter at theoverheadwire.com, established in 2006, and our over 100,000 item link archive tagged by topic and city. We'll leave a YouTube explainer video in the show notes for that one as well. Or you can just keep listening and enjoying the show. We appreciate that too. You can find us mostly on Blue Sky and Mastodon, sometimes on Threads, Instagram, Flickr, YouTube, Substack, and LinkedIn if you want to connect, usually at the Overhead Wire, but with Flickr, it's called Transit Nerds. We've got some great stuff coming up in our 13th year of the podcast, so keep on listening for announcements. But for now, just enjoy the show. Danny Pearlstein, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Thanks for being here. Before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I am sitting here in Manhattan, 15 miles from where I grew up in Brooklyn. I've been riding the subway all my life and, myself on my own, probably since I was 11, which is the most special thing about growing up and being in New York. And, when I found out there was a Riders Alliance, I was eager to become a member. That was over a decade ago. And I guess I came on staff a little over 8 years ago. I've been doing this work for about 8 years. And congestion pricing has been a through line. It was just getting more attention around the time I started. It was just a couple months after then Governor Andrew Cuomo said, having opposed it, that it was now an idea whose time had come.
So obviously you're in New York, it's in your veins, the subway, but do you remember like a first ride or like a first experience with the bus or anything along those lines?
With the subway, always the challenge was that when we would go places with my brother in the stroller, and he was a few years younger, we would have to walk further to get home because of very limited access at the station where I was growing up. And that's no longer true, right? There's much better access now, but the system had been so sort of like secured and partially shuttered and locked down, from the era of, real disinvestment, the 70s, early 80s, late 80s, that we couldn't get the stroller out of the station, with the very part-time token booth, unless it was open. So that was an early memory, that there was sort of a trade-off between like waiting for the local and walking from the express. But really for me, the formative experience I had of the city was when I was a daily commuter starting in 7th grade and being able to, get around the city myself, having close friends who lived, in the far reaches of Queens. And that was really when I first got on the bus, because I grew up near many subway lines, but taking the bus through Queens, now living in Upper Manhattan, taking the bus throughout the Bronx, and really appreciating the challenges that are unique to riding the bus compared to the subway in the city.
It's so freeing for a young kid to have that kind of access. I mean, where I grew up, it was a suburb of Houston, but we had bikes and we went all over the place with our bikes. There's a trail system that I'll actually talk about in a future episode, but it was really freeing to just have that freedom to go wherever you needed without being driven around, which I think in a lot of places outside of New York and even outside of my suburb was what needed to happen.
Yeah, no, it's very special. It's incredibly lucky, and that's why I'm, committed to raising my kids here. They're running around in the background, and they're not quite ready to go out on their own, but we're all looking forward to that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I do want to chat with you about this 1 year anniversary of congestion pricing, but first I want to kind of go back in time and think about when all this started, like originally started talking about pricing for New York City. What were some of the origins of this policy?
Well, it goes back to the Columbia economist, Nobel laureate William Vickrey, who originally had a proposed peak period pricing for the subway to cut down on crowding. You can understand why. I mean, he proposed it in the 50s when employment in the city began to fall off and driving had really started to peak. And so there was a significant decline in subway ridership, from that time really for another 50 years. And then we saw, crush loading again, in the 2010s. But it was proposed then, it was something that was explored in the 60s and 70s during the Lindsay administration and afterwards to fund the subway, to assist compliance with the Clean Air Act before catalytic converters were widespread. And then it was dormant again, largely until Mike Bloomberg, as the mayor, took it up as part of his sustainability plan. But there was no grassroots movement behind it then. There was no transit crisis to motivate it then. And so it didn't really come together until that period in the late 2010s when there was a grassroots movement of transit riders that Riders Alliance had built. And there was a burgeoning transit crisis when subway delays quadrupled from 2012 to 2018.
I went back into my archives, and we don't go back as far as the 50s, obviously, but we found, I found a bunch of stuff about the 2008, death of pricing and that situation. And it was really interesting to think about during the Bloomberg administration, what was going on and how that almost got over the finish line, but didn't quite make it. And I'm wondering if you could kind of go back in time and regale us with some stories from that period as well.
So Bloomberg, he's a international billionaire. He has a home in London. He saw congestion pricing working its first several years in London, although he had sort of run, as a conservative in New York, and London was at that time governed by a socialist mayor. He thought that could work here too. And so, he did the best he could. He spent $1 million on contributions to the state Senate Republicans, who at the time were the majority in the chamber. And Republican support for congestion pricing was robust. But he couldn't win over the kind of broadly distributed outer borough Democrats in the assembly chamber who, were very numerous and in small districts. And ultimately, the speaker decided it would be unfair to his members to make them cast a difficult vote for or against congestion pricing in many instances. And so the speaker at the time, Sheldon Silver, who since, had a fall from grace and has passed away, he scuttled the Bloomberg congestion pricing proposal. And so it died then. And that was right before the 2008 financial crisis. And so in the aftermath of that crisis, there was yet another round of proposals for a bridge toll, which is somewhat similar. But what happened instead was a new payroll tax that was created in large part by then Lieutenant Governor Dick Ravitch, who had been the savior of the MTA in the early 80s when he created a bunch of different petroleum and related taxes to fund the resurrection of the subway after the 70s crisis.
So here we are, 1 year from them turning the cameras on. What do you take away from this year?
It's the best of times, it's the worst of times, right? It's a really challenging year. And we saw what just happened yesterday, horrific in Minnesota and over the weekend in Venezuela, just utter lawlessness by the government. And at the same time, government working for the people with the congestion pricing cameras in New York, cameras that the Trump administration has taken shots at, but so far, totally ineffectually. And what we've seen in a lot of ways is comforting in the sense that what was predicted has come to pass, right? The laws of physics and economics are the same in Singapore and in London as they are in New York. And so when you give people a nudge to take their car off the road, some of them will. And when you put a price on things and you collect the revenue, that those proceeds come in. And so traffic is lighter. It's a lot lighter in a few places. It's a little bit lighter in a bunch of places. And there's $500 million to fund public transit upgrades that wouldn't have come in otherwise. One of the, in some ways, more and less remarkable indicators is the polling, right? The program polled poorly before it started, the so-called Valley of Death that was true in other places as well. It started to poll a lot better once it started. Two things were at play. One is most people realized they weren't paying the toll. that they thought they might have to pay before it existed. And the smaller number of people who were paying the toll decided they really liked it because they were saving a bunch of time, and it was time that you could get for $9 that was unavailable at any price before the program went into effect. The people still objecting to it are further away from the situation. And so part of the problem previously was they were polling the entire state of New York. And so there was one poll from 24 that said 63% opposed, 44% never traveled to Manhattan for any purpose. Right. So what's it to them? But at the same time, their sort of new shape of the opposition is in the efforts by the Trump Department of Transportation to get the program stopped that have been effective, and in the kind of fact-free, statements from the president, and most recently also from Congresswoman Stefanik, now outgoing Congresswoman Stefanik, that toll has destroyed New York City, which is a lot like when Trump claimed that there were no more stores in Portland. It's just divorced from reality, and we don't know what he's being fed, but it's not the truth, obviously, and that's frustrating. But on the ground here in New York, everyone can trust their watch, everyone can trust the time on their phone, and they know that has shifted. And so even while there's nothing's perfect and there's always skepticism of big institutions, at the end of the day, government responded to a popular effort to fix a widespread problem in the form of traffic and transit funding and settled on a proven solution that, lo and behold, continues to work here as well as elsewhere.
I also want to ask you about the organizing and the activism of it all, because I think that's a really interesting part of this that maybe gets skipped over when we have these discussions. We could talk about the 51% through the Holland Tunnel, travel time savings and those types of things, which are great. But I want to go into like the expertise that you have about organizing and getting people together to support this, because one of the things that I've been thinking about lately is, and we had Carter Lavin on last week, whose new book is really wonderful in this respect, but how we get change and how change actually comes to pass. And this isn't just, as you mentioned earlier, this isn't just like, Kathy Hochul turned it on and it was there. And it took a lot longer and a lot more advocacy and work to get this to where it is now.
Yeah, it wasn't just Kathy Hochul, right? There were two governors who were lukewarm and insecure in their support for it, right? Andrew Cuomo had opposed it, then he embraced it, then it was passed, then he didn't do much to push it forward. Kathy Hochul came in when the environmental review had just gotten underway at the federal level, and she embraced it, but then she begged off when she saw the polling on affordability that turned out to be a real harbinger of the 2024 and 2025 elections. I think what she didn't appreciate is that while everyone pays the price of groceries, very few people pay a toll to drive to Manhattan because very few people drive to Manhattan. It's unpleasant. It's already very expensive. But what we were able to do, at key points throughout the process is mobilize a grassroots base of transit riders who wanted to see substantial change. And that started, with our neighborhood-based Riders Alliance organizing, a dozen years ago around some local train stations in Brooklyn where the train didn't come frequently enough. And then quickly realizing that actually there was a broader transit funding situation, and that as, the lack of transit funding became more apparent, the system also started to really stumble. Train delays skyrocketed. There was no light at the end of the tunnel for people who needed subway accessibility. All good reasons to raise a lot of money to fix the subway, and no obvious source of revenue. And at the same time, traffic was bad and getting worse. Like the buses were slowing down. Buses had lost ridership. There was the advent of rideshare vehicles, right? Uber and Lyft coming onto the scene, slowing down traffic even more, but also creating, some additional support for congestion pricing in various ways. But what we did was we organized in strategic neighborhoods and moved key legislators off the fence in support of the program by coming to the realization that their constituents wanted them to take a controversial vote to fix the subway. And ultimately, it was packaged inside the state budget, right? Nobody voted up or down on congestion pricing itself. But the speaker, just like the previous speaker, didn't want it in the budget unless he knew that there was majority support among the membership. And so we got there mostly by mobilizing in Brooklyn and Queens, the largest counties in New York. Brooklyn has 21 assembly members. Queens has 18 out of a total of 150. So a lot of transit riders and a lot of legislators in those big counties. And then in a sort of rapid response, when Governor Hochul paused congestion pricing with an apparent plan to scuttle it permanently, we tried to close off the exits, right? So, we prevented passage in a couple of critical days at the end of the 2024 legislative session. There were some alternatives floated that we quashed. We rallied in New York, we rallied in Albany, I think a couple of days in a row, and quashed those. And so they didn't come to pass. And the legislators went home and they had the elections. And then, we also sued the governor. And so she didn't have another good funding option. She had a lawsuit holding her to account for the 2019 state law. And then she had an incoming Trump administration, which I think finally sealed the deal for her, that there wasn't going to be new money coming to rescue her from Washington, D.C. Quite the contrary. And realizing she had to do it and she had to be brave. And she had all the talking points. She had been talking the best game about it in town for a couple of years. So she knew just what to say again. She cut the toll from $15 to $9, but she turned it on. And she was very quickly pleasantly surprised, like so many people, that the thing just worked. And I think we all have stories from people who were skeptical, right? They couldn't figure out exactly what wouldn't go wrong, but a new toll doesn't sound so appealing. So of course something's got to go wrong, and it didn't. From the beginning, it had been really battle tested and every I and T dotted several times. It just worked. There was a tremendous investment by the MTA, in making sure that would work. And it did. And it continues to work every day to the extent that there's no longer any polling on the topic. It is part of the furniture. It is not a live political controversy. The pollsters have moved on to other issues.
I've been thinking about this a lot lately, especially related to just the big fight back that happened, the amount of work that was put in when it was decided that there was going to be a pause, which was really funny the other day watching the press conference with the mayor and the governor. And she said, "Oh, yeah, I was always going to turn this back on." And I was like, what are you talking about? If you're paying attention, you knew that that wasn't really the case unless somebody pressured you. But the pressure was really fascinating because the other day I was listening to David Roberts, who has a podcast called Volts, and he was talking with Samuel Bragg about misinformation and the way that things, people have their ideas about what they think is the right answer or the wrong answer, and they'll stick to it unless something changes their mind. And that change of their mind is like social proof, basically. And so what's interesting about this is like all of that fighting that happened during the pushback kind of galvanized a group of folks. And now everybody that was galvanized, as well as the people that saw this work, are now on the side of, this program happened, it worked, and we can do things again. And I find that really fascinating from just a lot of different perspectives. It gives me hope again, but it also kind of, I feel like, changed a generation of people into like active transportation activists to a certain extent.
In New York, there was never as much energy around congestion pricing as there was when the governor paused it. All at once, right? We had built it up over, 2018, 2019 to push it over the finish line in the legislature, but there weren't like several hundred people out for congestion pricing all at once at any given point until it happened for many, many days in a row, after June 5th, 2024. And, one measure, and I don't think this is true of anything else that I can think of, but there's a local news aggregator email, City and State New York, that comes out every morning and every evening. And it was the top story every morning and every evening for 2 weeks running. That doesn't happen. And that was actually something where, we were a little bit caught off guard by the groundswell of support that suddenly came out. The governor's team, I think, and the governor in particular, was surprised by the press interest in the pause. But like, there was no story like this that the press could feast on. There was just something so enticing about it. And I think, because it tied politics to traffic and everything in between. And, we thrive in our, media environment, which is a precious thing more and more, but we thrive on having a lot of traffic reporting, right? There have been traffic reporters in New York forever, and they cover transit and they cover what riders do. And that's been a big part, of our success, is getting the word out. And, it works. But I think that transit press corps, and the local press corps and the, TV news crews made it really hard for the governor to escape the pause and to just like get things to quiet down. And so they didn't. And so she kept saying things like, "Oh, it's going to raise the price of a piece of pizza." And then everyone would jump on her for saying, "Oh, New Yorkers don't say piece, we say slice of pizza." And so it was a real moment where New Yorkers came together, to sort of like have that reality check. And I think, it wasn't obviously the decisive factor. It contributed to the rise of Zohran Mamdani running on affordability, but also running on the quintessential features that subways and buses are in New Yorkers' lives, starting, with the proposal of free buses that was alive in October 24, right, during the pause.
Yeah. I'm also curious, like, why are the feds so against it? I mean, aside from just like not liking liberal places, I mean, there's a weird kind of thread that goes through it from my perspective here on the West Coast, at least.
It works. I think that's one problem with it, right? Government should not work for the people. That's a problem. If you want people angry at their government all the time. I think they also see it as a cultural wedge issue, right? It's those coastal liberals telling you to leave your cars at home. This is your freedom that's at stake that should motivate you. And the same sort of, freedom that motivates you to do all sorts of other antisocial things. And then I think the last piece of it is, I think, and this is newer, but also a long time coming, which is that like they're indistinguishable from the oil industry. They're a subsidiary. And this president promised as much. And I think it seems weird, right? Because it's efficient, it's a user fee, it's pro-business, right? It didn't just have grassroots support in New York, it had business and real estate support. But it's like, it's almost like it's too rich of a vein for them to go after. But because they have so little to stand on, they resort to, silly stuff like the city is dead on account of a $9 toll,
which is just with your own
which
eyes.
Is just nonsense, right? You can go outside and you see it's not true. And transit ridership, which is something we could talk about, right? It's been rising since the pandemic. It's risen a lot in the past year. In large respects, it's back to pre-pandemic levels outside of the rush hour.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a huge thing, is the rising transit ridership, and also just the impact of just seeing more people out and about, especially after the pandemic. That's an interesting time period as well, as like the pandemic from 2020 on, it's been kind of a major feature in our lives. And so, the comeback, as it were, from that is also just like a big story in itself, and something that feeds into this discussion as well, I feel like.
I think there's one other thing. It's that, they want us to feel unsafe. And so being able to confidently go out in public without a, multi-ton tank around us, is a reminder that we are safe. And, forcing people into transit, is this narrative of, right before congestion pricing, right, catastrophically, a woman was burned to death on a subway platform, rather than talk about homelessness or alcoholism, the things that contributed to the death. We talk about immigration and transit safety and law and order. And they want a narrative that you should be scared to ride the subway. And that's bipartisan, right? There's plenty of Democrats who dine out on that as well, or at least tried to. And that failed in the last mayoral election for various specific reasons. But it'll be back. And, I think we'll see that in this gubernatorial campaign as well, because we've seen it so many times in New York, which is that the subway isn't safe. And again, it's a little bit of a denial of reality, which is it's getting increasingly safer, since the worst of the pandemic. And also that several million people ride it without incident every single day. We count for something, but you don't hear about it.
Yeah, that's the thing about New York that I feel like other places don't necessarily have, is like base of people that are riding every day. I mean, 4 to 6 in the past million people riding. That's a lot of people.
It's so many people. And it's a reminder also just how the MTA dwarfs any other U.S. transit operation. And that is also frustrating for people who don't like government, because it's this immense government apparatus that's incredibly complicated and costly to operate, but it employs close to 100,000 people and it moves several million people every day. There's no denying that.
Yeah. The other thing I want to ask about is like those things that people were afraid of before pricing, before the cameras were turned on, that didn't really come to pass. And so I'm thinking about the traffic outside of the zone, or the pollution that people worried about from trucks trying to avoid going through the cordon. Those types of things, the information about that was high because of the fear factor of it. But in the end, it didn't really pan out the way that folks said it would.
Of all the parade of horribles that folks trotted out, the only one that came to pass is that the thing would work and it would, whet our appetites for more. But I think, the fact that the traffic analysis was so far off is one of the more egregious aspects, because it was mandatory and it took years and it turned out to be bunk. That's infuriating. That should infuriate everyone. That was something the federal bureaucracy required of New York. It was something that the MTA and its consultants went along with, and it was garbage. And there were people, smart people, coming out of the woodwork early on saying, no, this doesn't make any sense. But like, it also took on a life of its own. Like the New York Times was able to take it to like random public health experts in other states who started to, hem and haw about what this would mean for, asthmatics and environmental justice communities, when in fact is in environmental justice communities in New York City, better transit is essential, right? Those same communities rely overwhelmingly on public transit. And of course, this didn't produce, a spike in asthma, right? We're not seeing that. We're not seeing anything like that. And, naysayers will still do silly things like post pictures of red traffic roads on Google Maps, but like those don't distinguish between traffic speeds below 30 miles an hour, which most New York streets are below 24/7. So I think that merits some kind of reckoning, and this is, part of a lot of different discussions we're having about planning and approvals. Why did we have to jump through all those hoops? And why were they so worthless?
I feel like that's actually something that would be really welcomed in other places too, because the other places that are talking about pricing probably need that reckoning to push forward even more. I mean, you have the truth that it's working, right? But you need a little bit more in some places here, like here in San Francisco, for example. We could try to do this and push it forward, but there's going to be all this discussion about the collapse of the market for office buildings and things like that is really going to push people back, even though there's still a lot of car traffic in San Francisco. There's still a lot of Bay Bridge traffic coming in to the city. And so, that proof that even more it was wrong than we said it was going to be would be super helpful in LA, in Boston, in San Francisco, in other places that, could actually benefit from pricing, and it could benefit the transit systems here and there.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, the only concern in the other places, I think it's even more important to follow the London model of improving transit first. And I mean, relatively speaking, across time, like we are seeing that in LA, right? LA transit is much better than it was 30 years ago, which is not true of New York because New York's transit system is so much older. But right, the equity concern is not, that we're going to create hotspots or whatever else. The equity concern is just like, are we charging the people who can best afford to pay? Which in New York we are, because overwhelmingly low income people are already in transit. In San Francisco, if like there's a lot of middle income people who are driving in from the Central Valley, right? That's something we want to solve for. In tandem with rolling something like this out. In New York, there's not a population like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to know something that you think that hasn't been paid as much attention to as maybe it should. There's a lot of discussions. Obviously, the newspapers drive a lot of the discussion about this. Is there something that you notice that isn't really getting a lot of airtime?
Again, I think one of them is the fact that the models failed us, and that says a lot about the pseudoscience, that goes into traffic analysis, and that, we should know, induced demand for what it is, and take it at face value, which is that if you make it easier to drive, more people will drive, you'll lower the cost of driving. You make it easier to take transit, more people will take transit relative to other ways of getting around. I think sometimes that gets lost in the sort of politics of congestion pricing, because it's a lesson that we can extrapolate further. But otherwise, I do think that like it has taken on a life of its own as an issue where it has been very extensively covered. And so compared to things like the federal funding of transit, it's been exhaustively covered, right? And there are other issues in transit funding besides congestion pricing, right? It's not solving all of New York's problems forever. Like we still have this structural challenge of finding new funding sources every so often that gets harder and harder to meet. And congestion pricing, for all of the excitement around charging a fee to drivers, and why that sort of takes on a life of its own, isn't inclusive of all transit news in the way that I think some outlets would like it to be.
Yeah. So one thing for me is that, and I've been kind of pointing to pricing as a policy win that we should take kind of positive news from and use that to say that, government can work when we do it correctly. It's different than trying to build a Second Avenue subway. For one thing, it's like it takes longer to tunnel than it is to turn on some cameras. But at the same time, like going to China this year and seeing kind of all the stuff that's been happening there and seeing what happened with pricing, I feel like very positive about like we can actually do stuff. And I feel like that's been missing over the last like 4 to 10 years, which is, we can actually do these things. And turning the cameras on was actually proof that, some of the policy things we've been talking about for 50 years actually work.
I think that's exactly right. I think we need to develop, a muscle memory of how to do difficult things in politics. And then also a muscle memory of how to build, right? New York built an extraordinary amount of transit infrastructure, in the first third of the 20th century. That was an explosive period for us. China has done more in a more compressed period, but we did have that critical period here. And that's why we have this tremendous legacy that we're struggling to care for. But we can expand on that. We can build on that. I think, having the Interborough Express, which is in its sort of early engineering stages, will be the most transformative, built project since the Second World War in New York, right? Nothing since has compared to that. And that should also embolden us to do even more, and to go beyond that.
What's next for New York City and after the pricing?
At the Riders Lines, we're very focused on improving bus service because, no matter how quickly we can stand up more rail lines, we need interim, at minimum, much better buses. We have the slowest buses in the country. Congestion pricing has moved the needle a little bit on the slowest of the slow buses in the core of Manhattan. But where people are relying on buses most, in the outer reaches of Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Queens, the buses are very slow in commercial districts. They're very slow where they connect to the subway. And that is because of a lot of car traffic. And so I think there's a question of, how do we get those cars out of the way? If we're going to have free buses, how do we fund free buses? Could that involve charging for parking in a way that would reduce some driving and parking, as well as sort of hitting the sweet spot of bringing down in the funding, which is what congestion pricing does, right? It does two things at once. Parking charges could also do those two things at once. Um, and how do we, speed up individual corridors and get to the point where we have bus rapid transit? We looked at a couple of corridors and we found that, with BRT conditions, we could be saving 10 to 15 minutes per trip, off of trips that take 30 or 45 minutes. That's an enormous savings. And, for long suffering bus riders, that's especially meaningful on a par with saving the bus fare, right? We want the bus to be fast and free. Both of those things are very meaningful to people who have little money and little time.
I feel like that was the wild thing about, just how much time car drivers were saving from the charge, like the amount of time, the first couple of weeks was crazy about like people talking about how they got to places 30 minutes ahead of time or 45 minutes ahead of time. This is just wild. And so if you could do that for bus riders, right, how amazing would that be?
Right. Bus riders who aren't, who have such a small footprint, so to speak, in the public space, and are moving so efficiently and yet are really stymied because it's not effective. It's not an effective way to get around in so many cases where it moves at a walking pace. But yeah, right. The biggest beneficiaries, of congestion pricing so far have been drivers from New Jersey, the place that is still suing New York over congestion pricing.
What's your favorite benefit of the result of the pricing?
I think that in all of this conversation about affordability, it's important corollary that part of having an affordable, city is setting the prices right. And so counterintuitively, charging for driving into a very desirable, well-connected area of the city can actually save people time. It can save some people money. It's saving in significant ways in terms of reduction in crashes, right? Crashes don't just result in the loss of life and limb. They eliminate wage earning capacity. They drive up healthcare costs, right? We can be very crass and say, like, let's set the emotions aside. Like, a crash is really bad for your wallet, whoever you are, and there have been estimates that the city, New Yorkers collectively spend billions of dollars each year on traffic crashes. And so to the extent that we can, speed up traffic a little bit, not so much that the crashes are more damaging, but a little bit so the frustration and the anxiety are decreased and there's less traffic overall to get in a crash, which is, I think, what we're seeing, that closing in on that sweet spot. That's really something, right? It's really something, in terms of human life and limb, and as well as the pocketbook. And so we can hit those notes each, as well as something that's just, people say, well, cities aren't loud, cars are loud. Honking is way down because of congestion pricing. And, as someone who doesn't live anywhere near the congestion zone, I'm jealous, right? Because I want honking reduction here. I want I want all EVs so I don't have to hear engine noise. We all deserve a quieter, more livable space. The irony is, you say, well, if you like that, you move to the suburbs. But then, as my friends describe, you hear suburban noises like leaf blowers. And in the city, because I live near a park, I also hear a lot of leaf blowers. So I get it all. But we deserve, if we're going to live closer together, as I think in a lot of respects is better for people and for the planet, we need to live a little bit more sensitively closer together and cut out some of that unnecessary noise. And I think that is something where, by lowering the levels of anxiety and frustration of sitting in traffic, congestion pricing is saving people's ears. And that's a grace note, of the program overall.
It's such a public health issue. The noise pollution, it contributes to hypertension and a bunch of other things. Obviously, the particulates and the air quality matters for respiratory diseases, asthma, et cetera. There's so many things that are intertwined. I mean, you think about all of the rates of Alzheimer's and dementia and those types of things, which we've seen now from the research is coming from parts like microplastics, particulates, those types of things. As you say, we should all be very much more sensitive about living close together because, a lot of the research is often down about cities because of, how many instances of mental health issues, how many instances of respiratory issues, et cetera, come from being in a dense place. But that's because of the, secondary effects of driving most of the time. And so I feel like that's something that is a little bit under discussed as well, is just like the whole public health outcome of living closer together which is beneficial for us because we can walk everywhere, et cetera, but also from the reduced amount of particulates and reduced amount of noise, et cetera.
And that's something that came up even before congestion pricing started, when we were pushing back against some of the analysis that said, look, this is going to be, bad for environmental justice communities around the zone because traffic is going to divert. We said, like, even in the scenario where it diverts, there's going to be less overall pollution in the region. And so that pollution moves around. And even if there's some local increases, there's some regional decreases to offset that, as well as the hundreds of millions of dollars that the program is spending on actual emissions mitigation at this point, just to mitigate background emissions, because there's no new emissions owing to the program. But that's a really important point, which is that, and again, it's not just respiratory health, it's the costs associated with poor respiratory health that are being alleviated downstream because of congestion relief.
Yeah. There was a research, it was really interesting. There's research in Tokyo, or maybe it was Kyoto, I don't know, it was somewhere in Japan, where they had done research around a transit station, and they found that because of the station and the development around it, they had reduced healthcare costs by X% or whatever because of that, which is really fascinating. And I'm wondering if that could be reproduced after this. There's probably a ton of studies that could happen related to that, right? There's just so many things you could want to find out. Well, so I do kind of want to go over some of the things that actually that happened. There have been a lot of articles talking about the benefits. There was Emily Badger and et al. had a New York Times article talking about, some of the benefits: 73,000 fewer vehicles, faster traffic for in some cases going across tunnels, through bridges, through tunnels and over bridges, more transit riders, bus speed increases. Obviously, we just talked about the noise pollution emissions and reduced crashes. There's just so many things that are beneficial that have come from this. And I did want to mention them, because it wouldn't be, a good discussion if we didn't actually mention some of the things that have been benefit. I just feel like sometimes because of, the folks that are listening to the show know that to a certain extent, but it's good to reiterate.
It's a PSA. Right. It's good to reiterate, somebody should buy a spot on Fox and Friends and just read that out, so that a certain viewer, gets that, right into his veins.
Well, I saw earlier today that Joe Scarborough, who is not necessarily the most liberal host on MS Now, I guess it's called, was telling, congratulating the governor on the pricing, the wins. And so I find that's a pretty big deal from the media landscape.
Yeah, we had that, in the first several weeks of last year, and then we diverted to all the distractions of the Trump administration. But it's nice to kind of be reliving that kind of, greatest hits, over the course of these. It's just the governor's she's beaming over it, because, she's not getting any of the blowback she thought she was, and she's getting all the adulation, from these New York City wonks and urbanists all over the place, when she's, comes from 400 miles away, and she's, in a way, we're having, our best governor for transit in an incredibly long time, because she's the first one who actually had to prove something to people in New York City, as opposed to proving herself upstate, right? She's from upstate. She has to prove herself here, and this is how she's doing it. And, with the exception of the pause, she's doing a bang up job.
Yeah.
And so, I think that those stats, the wait times at the Holland Tunnel, I think will always take the cake, just because they've decreased so dramatically. And 50%. It's just people in New Jersey just don't want to pay for it, and and I don't know what that's doing in New Jersey, but it's doing something good, right? You have all these roads that sort of funnel into the Holland Tunnel, and now there's many fewer drivers on them. They're already seeing a benefit in terms of wanting to redo some of the study work for the New York Jersey Turnpike expansion that the previous governor had planned to push more cars into the Holland Tunnel, is saying this doesn't make any sense. There's a toll at the other end. People don't want to pay it. That's another downstream effect, right? I think it's dissuading. They've scaled that project down somewhat, not entirely, since congestion pricing.
My favorite is them threatening to do pricing the other direction. I was like, don't threaten us with a good time.
And it's so ironic, because New Jersey is by far the state that rakes in the most tolls, and 30 or 40% of those tolls already come from New Yorkers, right? We can't really drive to New Jersey without paying a toll on a major road, including Interstate 95. And so it's such a weird combination of sour grapes and crocodile tears and whatever other metaphor you want to use for them to complain at all about this. But it's for them, it's smart politics, right? It's the same reason why, Secretary Duffy or President Trump wants to do it. It's let's go rail against something that is superficially should be very unpopular, but for some reason is essentially one weird trick at this point.
Yeah. Well, where can folks find out more about what you all doing and sign up for your alerts and get involved?
Sure. Well, we're on the web at ridersalliance.org. We're on Twitter at Riders Alliance, Instagram, Facebook, and we hold regular meetings. We have a newsletter that comes out, and we rally. I think we're rallying in the Bronx for more affordable fares later this month, and at City Hall. So we have an active schedule. Sort of making the most of this moment around fast and free buses.
And where can folks find you if you wish to be found?
I'm at Danny in Transit on Twitter, and I'm here right now. I'm here in my closet in Upper Manhattan, and I'm regularly I do a lot of interviews out at the A train station at Dyckman Street because it's a great backdrop.
Nice. Well, Danny, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Great meeting you. Thanks so much for having me.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters who support this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. You can support the show as always by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Sign up for our almost 20-year-old newsletter as well by visiting theoverheadwire.com or check out the show notes for merch or other opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find it at its original home at usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways. Hey everybody, thanks for listening this far past the credits. If you're here, I just want to say thank you to all of our generous Patreon supporters, especially those in our $10 Dallas tier and above. I just want to share their names, first names only, of course, but I figured this is long overdue that I let folks know that their support is much appreciative. Obviously, all the tiers are very appreciative, but this group has gone above and beyond over the years, and I really appreciate that. Andrew, Ben, Derek, Gabrielle, Glenn, Greg, James, Jeremy, Jim, Joseph, Catherine, Mao, Marcus, Matthew, Mike, Nicholas, Oliver, Steve, Abraham, Abby, Ed, and Matthew. We really appreciate you, and just can't say enough about how much the support from you all and everybody else on Patreon has really helped us out. So I just wanted to say a quick thank you to everybody, and yeah, so we'll see you next time.